Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, and then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Alyssa Bream, and we are looking at a passage in Genesis chapter 29. So the theme we're going to look at this week is dealing with dysfunction. There's a lot of dysfunction in the Old Testament, and so let's kind of take a look, give you some background here so you understand what we're talking about. Today we're talking about Jacob's wages and this dysfunctional family concept. So the word wages becomes this key word in Jacob's story. The related nouns and verbs will occur 11 times in 3 chapters. Additionally, the concept of wages, or what one deserves or what one believes he deserves, is hinted at repeatedly throughout this story. We immediately find ourselves in a culture, though, that is different from ours. There are certain things with which we can hardly relate from a Western perspective, right? But they're critical for us to understand this text. The first critical thing is the different marriage customs. While most of us have likely heard of the practice of a potential husband giving a dowry to the father of the bride-to-be, since it's not practiced in our culture, it's very difficult to relate to. Other key unusual customs concerning marriage include a marriage feast that lasts for 7 days, and the practice of covering the face of the bride completely with a veil during a ceremony. Even though we do have the veil piece most of the time in a wedding, it's pretty opaque. You can see who's there. The second critical thing that is key to understanding this text is the Jewish custom of giving the birthright and the blessing to the firstborn son. This custom plays heavily in the life of Jacob. It is a critical piece of the story. So before a father dies, he will divide his inheritance among his children. This is typically done in front of witnesses and especially in the sight of God. Because the eldest son will be responsible for the welfare of his mother once she is widowed, and for the family business and estate, it was common that the oldest son would receive twice as much of an inheritance as the other sons. And we would find this referred to in the New Testament with the prodigal son, a similar division. So before a father dies, the Jewish custom was that he lay his hands upon each of his sons and verbally speak over them a blessing. Therefore, in chapter 49 of Genesis, you find Jacob blessing his own sons. This blessing was not to be taken lightly because once these words were spoken over the sons, they could not be retracted. Because this blessing was also given in the sight of God, it became the equivalent of a signed document with God as the notary. God would bring to pass every word that was spoken over a son by his father during the blessing ceremony. So here's a little background on Jacob's character as well. It's often been pointed out that when Jacob and Esau were born, they were twins, by the way, Esau came out of the womb first, and Jacob was holding on to his heel. And I'm going to mess these Hebrew words up, but you'll get the point. The Hebrew word for heel is akib, and the Hebrew word for hand is yah. Thus, the child was named Jacob, or Yaakib. Or Yaakov, literally translated as hand on the heel. The implication behind this name is the one who catches the heel of another person causes them to trip and fall. It is a metaphor for tricking someone or deceiving someone, and Jacob will live up to this name. In Genesis 25, verses 29 through 34, we find the account of Jacob tricking his brother in order to receive the birthright. At a time when Esau had been hunting in the field and was physically exhausted, apparently having gone some time without food, Jacob had made some lentil stew. Rather than sharing the stew with his brother, he used Esau's hunger against him, forcing him to promise to give him the birthright in exchange for a simple meal. Because Esau apparently believed he was near death, he agreed to this exchange, and thus Jacob gains the birthright. Jacob also tricked his brother out of the firstborn's blessing. This story is more dramatic and involves the aid of his mother, Rebekah. Jacob disguises himself and fools his father Isaac, who was near blind in his old age, into believing that he was Esau rather than Jacob. Isaac inadvertently blessed Jacob with the blessing that was intended for Esau. Jacob gains both the firstborn birthright and the firstborn blessing through trickery. Now, Jacob then, we find himself being tricked. So that's where we kind of end up today in this story. So he's forced to flee from home after stealing Esau's blessing, and because Esau vows to kill him. Jacob's mother urges him to flee to Haran, where he will be able to locate her brother Laban or Laban. My dad said Laban, and I think we had this conversation last year or year before that it might be Laban.
I think your dad might say a lot of words.
Well, there's no doubt about that. Anyway, so he goes to live with Laban and live there in safety from Esau. So while he's there, he falls in love with Rachel, who is the youngest daughter of Laban. After 1 month, Laban asked Jacob what his wages would be. Jacob had apparently been working for Laban during that time, and Jacob requested the hand of Rachel in marriage in exchange for 7 years of labor offered as a dowry for the marriage. So that was his offer. Although Jacob works for 7 years for the hand of Rachel, he is tricked by Laban. And on the night of the consummation of the marriage, it is Leah, Rachel's older sister, who is brought into the tent by Laban. Jacob unknowingly consummated a union with Leah instead of Rachel. It is likely that the tradition of completely covering the bride's face with a veil facilitated this process, and I would also say probably some of the 7-day party probably contributed to that as well. The next morning, when Jacob discovers it was Leah instead of Rachel, he confronts Laban. Laban explains it is not customary for a younger daughter to be married before the oldest daughter. So Laban offers to give the hand of Rachel to Jacob as well in exchange for an additional 7 years of labor. It's ironic. So Jacob wants to know why he's tricked him, So it's ironic that the word that was used to describe Jacob is now used by Jacob to describe the actions of Laban. After Jacob tricked Esau out of the blessing, Esau stated, "No wonder his name is Jacob, for now he has cheated me twice." Genesis 27:36. The Hebrew word for tricked is the same word as cheated in chapter 29 and in chapter 27. So we'll observe more about this dysfunctional character of Jacob as an individual a couple of lessons from now, okay? Now, let me give you a description of Jacob's family. Jacob now has 2 wives. In effect, he's living in this love triangle. Additionally, his relationship with his father-in-law is strained by Laban's deception. Leah is both an older sister and a second-place wife, so she exhibits the signs of rejection. Rachel is a wounded wife who sees her sister as a third wheel, an invader encroaching upon her marriage relationship, and she exhibits symptoms of envy and bitterness. So we begin to ask some questions about what this might teach us about dysfunction. One, it teaches us that broken people create broken relationships. One cannot help but notice that the dysfunctional family unit from which Jacob came seems to be a repeated pattern in Jacob's life. Just as the broken people in Jacob's childhood family created dysfunction, so the broken people in his developing family also create and contribute to dysfunction. It also teaches us that our own dysfunctional situations are not unique. It is sometimes easy to assume that the lives of the people of the Bible characters are not quite as messed up as our own troubled situations, but Jacob's story shows that relational dysfunction is not new. It also teaches us that God is in control in the midst of dysfunction. Sometimes it's overly stated and sometimes it's merely implied, but it is clear through Jacob's story that the hand of God is behind each sordid detail. So that's a lot of background information, but we want everybody to kind of get a feel for where we are. So, Alyssa, when we read a story like Jacob's, does it give you or us hope to face our own dysfunctional relationships, and if so, why?
I think it does. I think the interesting thing is when you said sometimes we assume that the lives of the Bible characters weren't very messy, and that our lives are so messy. Growing up, I always assumed the opposite, that all these Bible characters were so crazy because had a fairly normal, quote unquote, normal life,
Right.
where 2 parents in the home, it felt normal. So I was like, oh my goodness, all these people are crazy. And then as I've gotten older and seen more family dynamics, getting married, having all of those. And then as you grow closer to other families, as you move away and things like that, and you see all of those other things, then you realize, oh my goodness, maybe those people in the Bible weren't so crazy. I don't know. I kind of view that the opposite way.
Well, we tend to sanitize things when we preach it, right?
Right.
Unless we have some kind of felt need that we're trying to express about that day. But most of the Bible characters, even the ones that we would consider to be more godly than others, right? So even when you get to the New Testament, Paul has some dysfunction. Peter clearly has some dysfunction. John, the beloved, had some dysfunction. I saw this great reel the other day, and it was this guy. It was the four Gospels. The guy was doing the four Gospels, and he was like, we all agree on this. And then John said, well, I'm last, and he decides he's going to mess it up. And, he talks about, he was, the reel was making fun of John saying, I was faster than Peter, I was there first, all of those things. So I think we tend to sanitize it, or I think this is my observation about the dysfunction. When it's not us and it's far removed, it's not that big of a deal. And so all of these stories are not us, not far, they're so far removed. If we were living in this would be a real problem.
Right.
But when it doesn't involve us, we don't get so wound up about it. But you said your life experience. You may or may not have, and your parents are super kind and nice and probably pretty steady, but you had nothing really else to compare it to when you were younger.
Right.
Right. Looking back, you may go, well, that was kind of weird, or we did have some dysfunction. I'm not asking you to call your parents out. We did. I mean,
my mom listens to the podcast. I won't do that.
I mean, in my family, there were things that I look back on and I go, gosh, that was. I thought it was normal.
Right.
It probably wasn't as normal as everybody else. And when you live it, and as I've gotten older, I've experienced a lot of those things. When you're living it, it's much more heavy.
One of the things that I think I have seen the layers ripple down through my family is my father's mother, so my grandmother, her brother died tragically when he was maybe 10 years old or very young. He was running in the backyard and he was a Boy Scout and he had been tying knots and he got caught in it and just bam, accidentally hung himself and died.
Oh, no.
And so my grandmother lived with that her entire life. And so that caused some repercussions throughout generations, and it caused some really strong heartache there, obviously. And I think that has come down through the family. And I as I grow older, I see how that played out in different ways in that side of my family. And that was really painful. And then when we were cleaning out my grandmother's house after she had died, we went up to the attic and there was like a huge painting of him. And like we saw like that she had just held on to this, and they were like best friends in that age. And they always talked about him at family dinners. I mean, not like every single time, but it came up occasionally about him, about Raimi. And so I think you can see how that really affected my great grandmother, who I did know. I knew her. She died when I was a senior in high school. Like she lost all of her teeth because of this, because it just was such a tragedy and such a thing that just hit the family so hard. So you can see how things come down the line, and that has affected things in my life in some ways. But there eventually you either find somebody who will maybe stop that dysfunction and deal with it. And I think that's the key to dysfunction in family, is being able to be honest about it and deal with it.
And sometimes we're creating dysfunction and don't even realize it, right? I think about how, there are words or phrases from my generation that are offensive to people today. And there were words or phrases from the previous generation that were offensive to my generation. And I think about words or phrases that this generation is currently using that they think, okay, we're all politically correct. We're caring for one another. That the next generation is going to go, that's horrible. Like, how could you have done that? And I think sometimes we create that dysfunction completely obliviously, right? We think we're doing the right thing. We think we're making the right correction, but sometimes it is it's causing more harm than we realize. And other times we just don't even realize that we're hurt, right? We don't. The the old saying of hurt people, and you don't realize sometimes what you're carrying around,
Right.
how it's affecting you. Sometimes you do, right? Uh, that that piece of self-awareness is so critical in these moments, and to know how what you're doing affects generations. That's the thing about it, is sometimes you don't see how it's going to have an impact. Barbara and I are watching a series right now. It starts with an accident. Like, this accident happens and somebody dies, and the person who eventually they commit a crime because they don't know what to do. But what had happened was an accident, right? And but now, I'm like 7 episodes in, and that one accident and that one person trying to cover it up has created this whole web of, lots of people covering things up, and dysfunction and deceit and lying. And when we don't deal with those things at the moment,
Right.
they drift and spread. And, it can be family relationships. It can be death that we don't deal with. I have not, to this point in my life, experienced that kind of close personal tragedy. I still have both of my parents. My grandparents were supposed to die, and the one that was passed, I was a year old, so I have no memory of it. The other 3 were well into their 80s or 90s when they died. So I don't have that knowledge, but I do know how other loss can affect you generationally, whether it's the loss of a family or the loss of a business or the loss of a job. If you don't deal with it properly, there's ripple effect.
I think this has been done in sermons before that I've sat in, where, like, if you or someone in your family has been affected by divorce, addiction, and, like, they name off just a few things. If you ask those people to stand, everyone stands, because everyone has had someone close to them who has dealt with a massive issue that could have been completely life altering and could send those ripple effects throughout them. And so even if you aren't personally dealing with dysfunction, you're dealing with the dysfunction of people around you.
Why do you think God allowed this kind of dysfunction to be written into the story?
I think whenever you give people freedom, there's going to be mistakes. And so we have freedom from God in a lot of ways. And it teaches us, like you had said, that even in our dysfunction, even in the ways we see dysfunction around us, that this isn't unique, and that other people have dealt with dysfunction, and maybe that will help us feel a little bit less lonely when we're dealing with those hard issues in our own lives.
I would hope that it gives us some empathy that we might not would otherwise. There are, I think, I'm going to make this as generic as I can. I think there are times we see things in other people's life we wish they would deal with. But at the same time, they see things in our lives they wish we would deal with. And trying to be a little bit more self-aware and dealing with those things to try to, because when we correct them, there are generational blessings that come as well, not just the challenges that come with it. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around the topic of dysfunction in Genesis.